Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Alan Kell. Welcome to our session this afternoon. I hope you come in all right on Zoom. We should have approximately 40 people tuning in this afternoon, so we look forward to having a good session. Next. So we'll be talking about Our Living Village project for Seer and Jordan's, an online review and discussion. We're looking at it particularly as part of the Chiltern Society's Heritage Festival this year, also Seer and Jordan Society, our local society. Next. So first of all, I'd like to introduce some Zoom housekeeping. We're assuming that everybody has got a basic knowledge of Zoom, so this is not a Zoom tutorial, but just some key points around this afternoon's session. First of all, in order to manage the overall session with about 40 people, we will be turning your video and audio off during the presentations, with the opportunity for them to be turned back on again when we get to Q&A. This whole technical thing is being run by Owen Kell, and if you need to send Owen a message, you can send him a message via chat. So with regard to chat, it should be somewhere at the bottom of your screen, somewhere in the middle of your menu. It varies on different computers, but if you find chat, we'd like you to use that, and if you've got any questions or comments during the session, and in which case please send to everyone, and we will monitor those and refer to them at the end of the session and potentially bring you in. As I say, you can send specifically to individuals as well. So we'll aim to use that as feedback from you as we go along. The whole presentation will be recorded and made available online. If you've got personally got any issues or problems with that, then now's the time to recognize them. But we think it's important to make it available online. There are a lot of people obviously who couldn't join us this afternoon. So we'll make that available through the Chiltern Society and also locally. Next. So before we get into the detail, I'd like to introduce Simon Keary, who's the chairman of the Chiltern Society, who would like to say a few words of welcome.
Welcome everybody. My name's Simon Keary. As Alan said, I'm the chair of the Chiltern Society. It seems only yesterday that Alan approached the Society with an idea to research the history of the two villages in Buckinghamshire. Two villages which have a very rich history. It took all of, I think, a few seconds to realise the importance and the interest that there would be in that project. And the rest is history, pun intended. Material heritage, such as buildings, artefacts and scripts, is one of the main sources of the study of history and culture, mainly because it is considered primary information, which is not altered or changed in any way. It requires much interpretation and research, but is far more reliable than other sources of information. Striking the balance between the importance of material heritage and cultural heritage is truly the most crucial aspect of conservation. Sometimes material conservation must be done as the first step to conservation, allowing the cultural aspect to develop around it. And you'll hear more about those aspects of things through Alan's presentation. It therefore can be said that material conservation is just as important as cultural conservation. I remember well the two presentations at the beginning of this project that Alan did to both villages regarding the work that was going to happen going forward, and the interest that was shown at both those presentations. I'm really grateful for you being part of this story today, and I hope you enjoy the presentation that you'll hear over the next hour or two. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thanks for kicking us off. So everyone sit back, relax. I hope we've got a drink and some popcorn to hand, and we're going to have an exciting session of about an hour and a half, giving you an overview of the project and going into detail on some aspects of the project that I hope will be of particular interest to you. So an introduction first to the Our Living Village project and the concept, the idea where we started a couple of years ago. Next. So first of all, well, where are these two villages of Seer Green and Jordans? You are all spread around the area, the Chilterns, Oxford, and so on. So we are just close to Beaconsfield, just northeast of Beaconsfield, two small villages, Seer Green and Jordans. I was born and brought up in Slough, just a few miles to the south, and I think I was aware of Jordans, but I'd never heard of Seer Green before I came and started living here 40 years ago. So it's very tucked away, a little village on the edge of the Chilterns. Next. So here are the two villages. Welcome to Seer Green, the cherry pie village. We'll talk a little bit about that. And Jordans, the historic village of Jordans, managed by Jordans Village Limited. The two villages have existed side by side for many, many years. They are close together, half a mile, and yet in many, many ways quite different. Jordans you may be surprised to hear, most of Jordans is only about 101 years old. The village was built about 100 years ago, and we'll be going into some detail about that and about what was here before. Seer Green has been around for at least 1,000 years as a small hamlet, but whereas Jordans relates to the north, to Chufflin St Giles, Seer Green relates to the south and was for many, many centuries part of Farnham Royal, the Farnham Royal through the hundred system. So the two villages have got very different histories, and which is why we're finding it so useful to use them as part of the development of our Living Village project. Next. So Seer Green and Jordans Society was formed back in the 60s, like a lot of civic societies, looking at conservation, environmental and heritage issues. And over that time, we accumulated a vast amount of material, some of which was turned into booklets and so on, but much of which we've got on file in photographs and memories and so on. So that was very much the starting point locally for this project. Next. Because the challenge really was what do we do with that information? How do we make it accessible in an integrated way, and particularly in a dynamic way rather than static? And how do we make it enduring? Because a lot of communities have written histories of themselves over the years in book form and so on, which is a valiant project to do and a very valuable project. But what we became aware of was that it's a rather static object, the book. It goes out of date. It often goes out of print. Could we find a 21st century way of actually putting this information together to make it enduring and dynamic? And we particularly wanted it to be community-led and community-owned, because we want it not just to be a history, but an ongoing history. And boy, are we living through history at the moment with our COVID-19. How do we capture that sort of event and incorporate it into the background of our past history? So we want to understand the past, engage with the present, and influence the future of our two communities. Next. So the idea we came up with was Our Living Village, a 2-year community project to engage as many different groups as possible in the two villages and collect this information together in a systematic way. How are we going to put it together in this dynamic modern way? Well, we looked at GIS software, and we've selected ArcGIS, which is a commercial software product, graphical information system software. We'll be talking about that in more detail later on, but it has the potential to allow us to do all the things that we want to do. And one way of looking at that is we want to build a very deep, multi-layered cake of the histories of our communities, using the maps that are available to us, historic maps and current maps, and population over time, and family histories and so on. But not just those, but to marvel within those the diverse themes of village life. And again, we'll be talking about some of those. So this is the idea that we took to the Chiltern Society about 18 months ago now, and they agreed enthusiastically to partner with Seer Green and Jordans Society. So we are developing a prototype, and our aim is to have something which is not just of value here locally, but represents a prototype that the Chiltern Society can then develop and offer to other communities within the Chilterns. Next. So a quick overview of our session. I would start off talking a little bit about population and people research. We'll then look at some of the community research strands that we're developing. Two of them are in depth, religion in our two communities and music, literature and art. And then it will come back to me and I'll do a quick overview of some of the other research strands. We'll then look in detail, we'll then look in detail at the Jordan Centenary and the Jordan's timeline database that's been developed, which is a very important step forward for us, and then how that has been integrated through maps and spatial data integration into this GIS system. We're not there yet. We don't want to pretend that we are there yet, but we're getting there. And so this is very much a state of the art and where we intend to go next after this review. We'll look quickly at how we're interacting with other local initiatives as well, because we're not doing this in isolation. Clearly, there are many, many other things going on at this time. We'll then open it up to a Q&A session, which we would like to bring you in and make that as dynamic as possible. And then finally, just a few words about next steps. Next. So, getting into some of the nitty-gritty of the project, population and people research. Next. So there's a lot of population data out there that we've discovered. We've got a wonderful 1753 Godolphin map that we'll be looking at in some detail, which we sourced from the British Library. And we've also sourced the 1831 enclosure map, which is proving very useful in terms of population as well. Obviously, we're looking at the census data, the great 10-year census data available from 1831 onwards, and which, excitingly, we'll be getting the 1921 data in just a couple of years' time now. We're also reviewing data from sources like the 1939 register, which I wasn't aware of that, but just before World War II, there was a national register was run, which produced a lot of useful information. And also beyond that, there are some fascinating records available through parish records, births, deaths and marriages, and such things, again, I'd never heard of, the Lloyd's George Doomsday Book project back in about 1910, and early historical lists. Next. These are two examples of the sort of information that one can find on the community if one goes looking. These two are produced by a great little company called the Eureka Partnership, looking at Buckinghamshire, the Muster Book. These was anyone with a horse, I think, back in 1673, and the Posse Comitatus list, which was put together so that they could identify who was going to go and fight off the French when Napoleon tried to invade our country. Next, so here we have, for example, the 1798 Posse Comitatus for Seer Green. Every man in the village in 1798 who listed out who could potentially go and fight the French. One or two of them, have even got identified so that their physical ailments, such as one eye, lame in the knee, and so on. What a wonderful piece of intimate history. Next. So, turning to the 1753 map, and we'll be using this several times during the presentations. On the right, you can see an image of the map. It's hand drawn, obviously, but it's beautifully drawn, beautifully to scale, gives us an overview of the village of Seer Green at that time, which is what, 270 years ago now. And the basic layout of the village has not changed at all. On the left, we've got Bottom Lane running south to north up to Hodgemore Wood. On the right-hand side, you've got Wilton Lane, which is the boundary between Seer Green and Jordans. And the field layout, as Nigel Rothwell will be showing you later on, has hardly changed in that time. Next. So what we've also got critically is that's the centre of Seer Green as it was 290 years ago, spelled at that time S-E-A-R, Green. But look, and there we've got details of who was living in the village at that time, where their house was, and their names and so on. So what a wonderful historical starting point that is for the people in the village. Next. Then we move forward 100 years to the Enclosure Act. And again, these records are available and they're absolutely fascinating. This is when the new modern village was in fact created, because the shape, we just go back a slide. If you look at the shape of the green, there, it's one of those straggly greens, typical of an old Bucks village and so on. With people facing right onto the green, and then next it gets tidied up through the Enclosure Act and so on. So we can see new building plots being created and the modern village, that's the shape of the modern village being created. The population at that time, 245 to about 1/10 of the population now. Next. So if we want to look at people who are living in the village, really, there's no better place to look also than the cemetery. And this is a war memorial in Seer Green. And here we can see the names of many of the communities that were in that village at that time, and indeed are still in the village now. The Worleys, the Paynes, the Goodalls, and so on. These families are still with us. And on the right-hand side, Colin Body, who died in the Second World War. Next. So the family histories are of incredible importance to us. And Oliver Payne, who I believe is with us now as I speak on this seminar, he has provided us with some wonderful, rich information on his family. On the left is James Picton, one of our famous photographs for the village. James Picton, his great-grandfather, sitting outside Peaceful Cottage. And on the right, a very poignant photograph of Private Edward Payne, killed at the age of 19 in 1916. And Oliver has given us information that Edward was actually recruited at the age of 17, lying about his age, outside one of our local pubs, the Three Horseshoes. The recruiting sergeant came to the village, stood outside the village pub, and recruited the young men, offered them the King's shilling as they walked by. Edward recruited at 17 and dead at the age of 19. Next. Similarly, Colin Body has provided us with wonderful information about his family. And again, that name will come up as we go through other aspects of the village. On the left, Mrs. Body, lace making in Seer Green in the cottage near the church. And on the right, Lance Bombardier Colin Body, killed the day after D-Day at the age of 24 from our village. Next. So that just a quick overview of some of the ways in which we're pulling together information on who lived in the village, where they lived, and the family connections and so on. There's rich, deep knowledge within the families in the village about all of these themes. We're trying to put it together now in a very systematic way. So I'd like to hand over now to talk about some of the themes that we're looking at, the social themes that Simon alluded to in his introduction. And the first of those that I would like to introduce is religion in our two communities, which will be led by David Horncastle.
Thank you very much, Alan. Good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here. So religion in our two communities, there's three active religious groups, and they're all represented in this theme. So from the Quaker organisation, we have Anne Floyd, and from the Anglican Church, Geoffrey Brand, and then myself, David Horncastle, from the Baptist Church. And this is a very, very rich area. There's a lot of information that's been written, a lot that people have told us. And in 15 minutes, I can really only just scratch the surface. So what I'll do is give some overall timelines, which you see on this slide, and then I'll go on to talk just with a little bit of local colour about some of the people involved. But anyway, this is a very top level picture of the development of the different religious communities. I said there were three active ones at the moment, and of course you'll see four across the top there. I'll come back to that in a moment as to where the Methodists have gone and what have happened to them. But the oldest community by a considerable distance is the Quaker community, founded during the aftermath of the English Civil War, at a time when many people were interested in radically reshaping religion, let alone society and politics and so on. The movement itself dating back to 1652. And just a very few years after that, there were meetings going on of the Quakers in Old Jordan's Farm. And I would say at that point they were illegal meetings. It was still illegal to meet like that outside of organised religion, until the Declaration of Indulgence in 1687, which allowed different nonconformist groups, including the Baptists and the Methodists, to actually worship lawfully. And at that point, the Quakers were very quick off the mark, and within a year had built the meeting house, which still stands in Jordan's. Very secluded. Remember from what Alan said that Jordan's village wasn't there at the time, and so it was still secluded, still tucked away in the beech woods, just in case the lawful Declaration of Indulgence was ever rescinded. Next off the mark were the Baptists. Evidence from about the 1820s of cottage meetings in different houses in Seer Green, but really the church founded in 1843. It was founded in a building which was a lace school, which is the present-day Parish Church Hall in Chalfont Road. That was built in 1829. It was used by the Baptists from 1843, and they eventually bought it, raised the money to purchase it in 1857. And then following just behind that, the Anglican Church, as Alan said, we used here to be part of the parish of Farnham Royal. So a very long walk every Sunday if you wanted to go to church. Until 1846, the green which Alan pointed out in the centre of Seer Green was actually owned or allocated to the rector of Farnham Royal in the Enclosure Act, which Alan was talking about. So the Church of Holy Trinity was built on the village green of Seer Green. The point where everything starts to come together, 1851, where the whole country underwent a religious census. Sunday the 30th of March, every religious organisation, community was asked how many people attended church or the religious community that day. And you can see the numbers there. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the numbers for the Quakers. I've been trying to get hold of those. If anyone has that information, I know the Quakers were included in that census. Be very keen to see it. But that's where the Methodists come in. Evidence in 1851 that there was a Methodist church also in Seer Green. We don't know where it was. They were meeting in a dwelling house built in 1849. And on that particular Sunday, there were 25 people. So if you're at the moment sitting in a house in Seer Green built in 1849, it may well have been the Methodist church at that time. And after that, they completely drop out of sight. So once again, very interested if anyone has any further information on that. Since that, the Baptists are the only people who have moved buildings. They're a fairly nomadic lot. First of all, over the road from the Lace School to the new chapel in 1900, and then to the current building in the centre of the Manor Farm estate in 1980. And as I say, 3 of those 4 communities are still very active and live churches. So can you go to the next slide, please, Owen? And all the buildings I've mentioned are all still here, and many of you will recognise these. Just very briefly from the top left, Holy Trinity Church, built on the village green of Seer Green. The new Baptist Chapel of 1900 in Chalfont Road, now very tastefully changed and converted into a private house. Bottom right is the oldest building, the Quaker Meeting House in Jordans. Bottom left is the building which was the old Lace School, now the Parish Church Hall in Chalfont Road. And then the building site on the left-hand side is the current Baptist Church, just being built at the end of 1979, 1980. And if anyone knows who the young girl is standing by the fence, very interested to know who that is as well. Next slide, please, Owen. I just want to tell a couple of stories now about some of the people involved, because that starts to bring this to life. The buildings are important, but actually it's the stories of people where I really start to get interested in what's going on. So this next story is a man called John Plato, and the picture that we're looking at here is a document from 1854, which is the conveyance of land. And the document itself, we found it in the archives of the Baptist Union at Didcot. I would say it's as big as a bath towel. So to read this document, you don't just move your eyes or your head, you actually physically walk along it. Very difficult to actually read the whole thing. The land it's referring to, the land that's the subject of the conveyance, is the plot opposite the Lace School in Chalfont Road. And that's the plot on which the new chapel was to be built 45 years after this document. And it's the conveyance from a man called John Plato to William Body, a good Seer Green name. And we got very interested in who John Plato was. And we did some research, and he was a notorious drunken peddler, and he became an establishment figure, and indeed one of the most famous leaders of the temperance movement countrywide, which was obviously a very big thing in Victorian times. Very interesting to us. He owned land in Seer Green, and it gives us a view of morals and behaviours of the time. What I'd like to do is just read you a tiny extract from a book by a man called Dawson Burns, pen pictures of some temperance notables. And this is what the book said about John Plato. Recounts the story of a temperance meeting in Chesham. And it starts with, The lecture made a deep impression, and at its close, the only minister of religion present, the Reverend William Payne, brackets Baptist, rose, expressed his readiness to sign the pledge. His wish was at once carried out, to the great joy of the teetotalers present. They had at last caught one minister, one who remained faithful to the pledge to the day of his death. And it goes on to say, on the occasion now referred to, the pleasure caused by Mr. Payne's adhesion was followed by surprise. Among the outside hearers was one whose uncommon height enabled him to look over the head of all the others. And when Mr. Payne had signed the pledge, this spectator called out that he would sign too, and proceeded to carry his intention into effect. The crowd, dense as it was, gave way before him. He was well known to most, and too well known by some. He was John Plato by name, hawker by trade, and drunkard by inclination. He was on this evening in a muddled condition, which prevented him hearing anything intelligibly. Something like consternation prevailed as he sought to make his way through the meeting. And when at last he gained the table where the pledge book lay, the question arose, should he be allowed to sign? In the end, he was allowed to sign, less from the hope that he would be bettered than from fear of what might happen if he were prevented. Later that night, someone told Mrs. Plato that her husband had signed. And when he got back, Mrs. Plato was wise enough to say nothing to him when he arrived at home, concerned at the strange tidings that had been brought to her. But on waking, she asked him whether he remembered what he'd done the night before. No, he remembered nothing, but thought he might have been assaulting someone. The conjecture was not amiss, for at that time a warrant had been taken out against him for assaulting a minister. It was not that, she said, but he had signed the pledge at the temperance meeting. If an electric battery had been brought into contact with him, the excitement produced could hardly have been greater. All the night's events had been forgotten, and he pronounced the thing impossible. However, having been convinced that he really had done so terrible an act, he rose at once to consider what was to follow. And the story goes on, and he actually stuck it for 3 months. He succeeded at becoming teetotal, and he went on for 26 years. And as I say, that story is of interest to us. He became a freeholder in several counties, including in Seer Green. And it just gives us a little insight into some of the morals and behaviours of the time. And it's very interesting that some of the members of the Baptist Church, I'll go on to that in a moment, became very involved in the local Band of Hope, which was the local temperance movement. So another link there. Next slide, please, Owen. And this is just about 6 years later. Alan found this in the Bucks Free Press, 25th of June, 1860. And it's an anniversary meeting of the Baptist Chapel. Remember, at that time it was meeting at the Lace School in Chalfont Road. The first paragraph just gives some of the background information. But that second paragraph is wonderful. This little village has, within the last 10 years, been transformed from one of the most profane, immoral, and irreligious of places to an abode of piety, love, and all things of good report. They now appear to live and love as one family, and the little chapel seems to be the centre of their chief attraction. Intemperance and Sabbath breaking are very seldom met with, and almost every cottage is sanctified by its evening vesper. Thus, from being proverbially bad and a terror to the surrounding neighbourhood as a nest of fighters and highwaymen, it's become a little paradise where these once affrighted neighbours now love to visit, to be cheered with the scenes of piety and love. It is truly a striking instance of the power of the gospel, with only such instrumentality as Sabbath school teachers and a town missionary. So wonderful. If you live in Seer Green, you were a nest of vipers, and now you're a little paradise. Next slide, please, Owen. So just to finish off then, the final story I want to tell, and once again, this is only scratching the surface. Frederick Saunders, a very notable figure in the history of the Baptist Church here in Seer Green. And I'll just tell you a tiny bit about his story. The man who signed the original return for the religious census in 1851, a man called William Honor, he married. Their youngest daughter, Martha, married a potter called Albert, also a local preacher, and their eldest son was Frederick Saunders, born in 1871. Albert took over the Beaconsfield potteries at the end of Popcorn Lane, where until very recently the builders merchants Hussey and Saunders was situated. Shortly afterwards, Albert died, and at the age of 11, Frederick had to learn pottery. And in his teens, he started to take a Sunday school class. And one of the things I was delighted to receive in the research that we've been doing is 3 of his diaries. He was a prolific diary writer. And in fact, we got hold of these diaries from a man called Geoffrey Sawyer. Many of you may know Geoffrey. He's done a lot of work on the history of the village, the history of the churches. He actually provided us, apart from his diary, with his family tree. His mother was a body, and I worked out from the family tree his great aunt was Frederick Saunders' sister, which I guess is how he actually inherited these diaries. And we've got 3, 1893, 1941, 1940 and 1949/50. And it's just very interesting. I'm just going to pick out a few random selections, really. 1893 was notable in the Baptist Church as the 50th anniversary of the Jubilee year. Lots of big celebrations that year, which are documented in the diary on the left, the 1893 diary. But I've just picked at random a fairly typical Sunday. And it's just interesting to hear what Frederick would have got up to that day. So Sunday school in the morning, got on very well. I'm reading the words that you can possibly see on the screen there. It's written in pencil and quite hard to read. Got on very well. The lesson was chiefly on what shall a man be profited, and the full quote there, if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul. After that, Mr. Summers preached on answered prayer. At Sunday school in the afternoon, Mr. Summers gave a missionary address. The lesson was from Nehemiah on building the wall. And Frederick Saunders' summary of that was, he got on, but it was middling. And it was interesting in all of this, he does kind of give a running commentary on how good the sermons were. And when you read the whole thing, it ranges from splendid to very badly behaved for some of the boys in the Sunday school. But after the afternoon Sunday school, went to Mr. Berryan for tea, then took the service at the chapel in Beaconsfield, felt at liberty, felt the power of the Spirit, went to the guild meeting at Beaconsfield Chapel, which was very good, went to Mr. Summers for supper, had conversation on books, and so it goes on. And it's just very interesting to see the amount that he would have packed into a single Sunday. And as I say, that's a pretty typical one. Don't really have time to give much more of his story. As I say, he was a very influential person in the life of the Baptist Church. On the right-hand side, his diary was from 1941, and I'll just finish with a quote from Sunday, the September the 15th. A nice day, but cooler. I didn't go to Seer Green in the morning, but went in the afternoon. Spoke at the Bible class. Went to Coles Hill at night. Some blunder had been made, and Mr. Smith came as well. I took the service, about a dozen present. Heard of very heavy attacks on London. 165 German planes brought down, severe damage done. And I just think that's fascinating, the juxtaposition of the everyday with momentous events. That was September the 15th, 1940, what we now call Battle of Britain Day. The end of daylight raids on London as losses began to mount. And I just find it fascinating that there was that little blunder made and 2 people came to speak at Coles Hill Church that evening. And Frederick was the one that gave the sermon. So final slide, please, Owen. This just brings it right up to date. 3 very active religious communities still here in Seer Green and Jordans. If you go onto any of those websites, you find more information about the history, which is documented. Life in Seer Green, the Baptist one, you find both the history of the church and a bit of the history of the village as well. But the most important thing I'd say just in conclusion is that these are not just historical organisations, they're all still living. They've all done a lot to help to work, support the communities during the COVID pandemic. And they've all had the challenge of how they remain a religious community, a church, during this time of lockdown. And we have a saying, many people say this, that our buildings may have been closed during lockdown, but the church is still very much alive. So with that, I'll conclude the religious slot. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much indeed. Yes, indeed. Here we are in Seer Green, one of the most profane, immoral and irreligious places in the world, and we have become a little paradise. But I must say, when we first found that quote and used it at the local pub, they loved the idea that we were a bunch of fighters and highwaymen, just hiding away from the A40, ready to go and raid the rich people passing through from Gerrard's Cross. But now we're a little paradise. Thank you very much, David. Turning now to another very in-depth theme that has been researched as part of the project, I'd like to bring in Nigel Morgan, who we've actually got on recording, to talk about music, literature, and the arts in our two communities.
When Alan Kell asked me to look into music, art and literature in Seer Green and Jordans for this wonderful initiative of Our Living Village, or indeed villages, I had little idea of what treasures would come forth. In the next few minutes, I would like to speak briefly on just a few of the names and or events that particularly stand out. And I'm only sorry that time doesn't permit mention of more of them for now. Looking first at music, it was in 1942 that there was the first of the concerts in the atmospheric Mayflower Barn, Jordans, which included a performance of the glorious Schubert String Quintet by the Guerrilla Quartet and the cellist James Phillips. Within a year, the Jordans Music Club was formed by Reginald Jakes and Joyce Cook. Early artists included Benjamin Britten and Peter Pearce. Pianists of the standing of Clifford Curzon, Rosalind Turek, who required a hot water bottle to be run up and down the piano keys to warm them up, John Ogden, Imogen Cooper, Angela Hewitt, Paul Lewis, and Stephen Huff come to mind, as do such string players as Yehuda Menuhin, Joseph Suk, Jacqueline Dupre, Stephen Isserlis, and Julian Bream. Leading wind players here heard there included Leon Gussens, Dennis Brain, and more recently Michael Collins, while singers have included the two Elizabeths, Schumann and Schwarzkopf, though not on the same evening, and Janet Baker. In 2006, the Mayflower Barn was sold and no longer available, so the music club moved to the Jubilee Hall in Seer Green, where their success continues. The Seer Green music concerts were initiated and run by Alan and Jill Smythe. This series of concerts started in 1978, and the Gabrielli Quartet performed at the first. These concerts ran through the winter months until 1995. I should also mention some local residents who have been highly successful in the popular music field. Ozzy Osbourne, Val Luniken, John Anderson, who was lead singer of Yes, and Justin Sullivan, lead singer of New Model Army. Before I leave this brief look at music, it's wonderful that we have two such talented and active amateur choirs in Seer Green, the Ladies' Village Voices and the Men's Seer Green Singers, both led by Seer Green resident Jane Smith. In April 2013, we had the first Jordans Village concert. 9 local musicians and readers shared music and poetry. One of these concerts annually has provided a platform for local amateur musicians to perform, while for many of the others, pianist Esther Cabot invites professional performers, including on 2 occasions the internationally acclaimed violinist Michael Bachmann, to join her in duo and trio performances, to which young local players sometimes contribute. Melissa Alder, another resident of Seer Green and for several years leader of the Holy Trinity Church Choir, is a professional soprano at the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden. Now, turning to literature and the arts, we have had, and indeed still have, a wonderful number of residents involved in literature and the arts. Jordan's Village started in 1919, and by 1922 its amateur drama group, Jordan's Players, was putting on productions in the village hall. For decades there were 3 or 4 productions a year, the most ambitious of which were performed in the Mayflower Barn. These included The Pilgrim's Progress in 1951, The Nettle and the Mayflower in 1969, and Oh What a Lovely War in 1974. Seer Green's drama group ran from 1982 to 1988 under the energetic direction of Michael Hargreaves. Turning to books, the eventful early years of Jordan's were successfully recorded by resident Arthur Hayward in his book Jordan's The Making of a Community, published in 1969. Word has it that a follow-up to this may just appear in some form or another in the foreseeable future. Death in Dwelly Lane, a comedy thriller by the American Anglophile Frank Morley, was published in 1952. Now, I would describe it as an amusing, tongue-in-cheek, wry look at a community that had a very close resemblance to Jordan's residence and places of the time, capturing its atmospherics. Indeed, several of the characters could readily be identified as, well, Jordan's characters. When he wrote the book, Frank Morley was living in Longgrove, Seer Green, an outsider looking in, before moving to Jordan's with his family in 1954. His several other books were of a decidedly more heavyweight nature. He was a good friend and publisher of the poet T.S. Eliot. The art critic and poet Sir Herbert Reed, another friend of T.S. Eliot, lived for some years in Broom House in Longbottom, Seer Green, but moved away in 1949. In addition to his illustrious literary career, Herbert Reed must surely be unique in that he was a prominent English anarchist who was knighted by Churchill for his services to literature. The actor Tenniel Evans with his family came to Jordan's in 1963, and the BBC television presenter Bill Turnbull moved there in 1993. Television weathermen Bill Giles and Ian McGaskill were Seer Green residents too. Betty Calloway, trainer of the world champion ice skaters Torval and Dean, was for several years a familiar face in Seer Green until her death in 2011. Another artistic Seer Green resident was Joy Brand, a gifted painter who exhibited in the Royal Academy summer exhibitions, among other venues. The internationally acclaimed spy writer Frederick Forsyth came to Seer Green in 2010. Then, in 2016, he moved to Jordan's. During that time, he has written several bestsellers, including his autobiography, The Outsider, My Life in Intrigue. His support over the years for local events has been much appreciated. Jordan's now has its own pop-up cinema. It shows high-quality recent films, complete with comfortable seating, an Art Deco setting and a bar. At the 50th Cinema for All Film Society Awards in 2019, Jordan's Picture House was the winner in the Best Single Event category. Well, that's it in brief. What literate, musical and artistic villages Seer Green and Jordan's are.
Thank you very much indeed, Nigel. That was a recorded session, but Nigel is with us on this afternoon session. So if you'd like to pose any questions to Nigel or any of the other speakers, please do so using the chat function and drop them off just as soon as they're in your mind. So as to two of the themes, religion and culture, that we're looking at and digging into in depth so that we can relate that historically to location, timing and activity. And I'd just like to briefly step through at quite some speed some of the other research strands that we're looking at. Next. So built environment, natural environment, employment, trade and industry, schools and education, the village pubs, sports and leisure, war and peace. These were some of the themes that we identified early on by consulting with the community. There was another theme, in fact, rather amusingly, which I called the dark side, which was crime in the communities, which was actually a very popular one that people thought we should look at. But then when we thought about it a bit more deeply, we thought maybe it wouldn't be appropriate to record all that dark stuff on this project, although it does add to the rich tapestry of any community. But I'd like to take you through some of these ones that we are progressing. Next. So, in terms of the built environment, you've heard about Jordans and Old Jordans. This was the original farmhouse building in Jordan, 16th century, at which the Quakers were meeting before they built the meeting house, in fact. And so this is very much at the heart of Old Jordans, this building and the Mayflower Barn next door. Next. So, while Jordan's had its 16th century buildings, so indeed does Seer Green. This is one of the finest examples. This is Hall Place, which was dated around about 1600s or in the 1600s. For many years, the village belief was that this was the site of a Black Prince's hunting lodge, which is an interesting story. And there is a bit of a problem with the dates. There is the Black Prince, and he died in 1376. So we've got a couple of hundred years to bridge there. But you know, it's a nice, rich story, a nice, rich history, we will come back to this. In fact, later on when we look at some recent research work that has been done around the village for really ancient buildings. Next. Two beautiful 16th century buildings still in existence. Pond styles and colliers within the centre of Seer Green. Next. And then some slightly more modern housing around the green. Some wonderful Victorian photographs there. The High Street in Seer Green, which we didn't know we had a high street until we saw that photograph. These are the cottages on the western side of the church, which are no longer there. That's one of the cottages outside where Mrs. Boddy was sitting doing her lace making, and the cottages next to what was then the New Baptist Church, the bottom right photograph, with some of the local residents. Next. Services within the village came fairly late. This was the first public well in the village, Queen Victoria's Jubilee in 1887. It was opened. You can see top right the festival in what was called then the Wide Place within the village, the dancing outside the well, and then a wonderful photograph of it a bit later. Wonderful facility. There had been wells, but they had belonged previously, but they were private wells belonging to the pubs and so on. And this one was available to the villagers except on Sundays, when we are told it was locked up because it was profane to actually draw water on a Sunday, which is rather interesting. This, in fact, is a modest little building alluded to previously by David, the parish hall, now built in 1829, one of the first civic buildings within the community, and it was the lace making hall. And that 1829 date we get not least from the graffiti on the side of the building, which records that date. And on the right hand side, that was how the building was being used just about 20 years ago. In fact, it was our son's wedding within the hall. Next. Here she is, here's Mrs. Boddy sitting outside with her lace making. In fact, Seer Green became very famous for lace making in the 1860s period. And we can see from the census data, where of course occupations are recorded, the growth in importance of lace making within the community. But within about 20 years, it had gone as it was mechanized, and this hand making lace was gone. And the original building was then given up as the lace making factory, which is now the parish hall, and put to other purposes, not least the Baptist church. Next. One of the other major trades was woodworking from Hodgemore wood and the surrounding beech woods. These are wonderful images of woodworking. Mr. Gadsby making brooms on the left, and on the right we've got some of the Payne family Joseph Payne and his son, also called Joseph Payne, and they are bodging, making legs, which will then be sent on to centres such as Wickham for chair making. Next. Farming was also important, of course, but probably less important at that time than the actual woodworking. And so we've got some wonderful images of from the local fields, and one more recent one, in fact, from the mid 20th century, of pigs within Seer Green, and what was wonderfully known at that time as Brasher Row, which was one of the small communities within the village, which is the buildings have now pretty much disappeared and been replaced by probably some of the more upmarket homes within the village. But this is what it was back in the 50s, and we still have wonderful people within the village who, in fact, lived there at that time and can recall it. Next. Cherries is an important part of Seer Green's history. Cherry Pie Village, there's a wonderful recipe that was found in one of those old cottages that you saw earlier in the chimney, which records how to make a cherry turnover, as it is. In fact, the village was filled with cherry trees until relatively recently, and these were taken up to London to be sold. Next. So we're a hard drinking lot in Seer Green. We've heard from the religious research. These were our three pubs in the village. The yew tree on the left, with some fantastic local characters outside. They do look a bit like high women, don't they? But probably not. This was the yew tree, which sadly closed in 1909. But the two on the right, the Three Horseshoes and the Jolly Cricketers, I'm delighted to say are still with us and thriving. If you get the opportunity to come to Seer Green, you can indeed visit one of our great local pubs still, the Three Horseshoes and Cricketers. The school is obviously a very important centre within the village, within both villages. We've heard a little bit, and we'll hear a little bit more about the Jordan School. We've collected some wonderful time-related images for the school in Seer Green, and here you see two. And on the left, this is a body, Mrs. Body, who was the headmistress of the school in the early days when the school was founded in 1859. Next. So houses and people are important, but also so is transport, and the coming of the railway was a very important event for Seer Green and Jordan's, and this is an important character in the history of that. Lieutenant Colonel William Baring Dupre of the Dupre family, who owned Wilton Park. Next. And this was his home. This was the White House in Wilton Park, with money made in the East India Company and invested in buying and developing Wilton Park, and indeed much of the surrounding area. This building sadly was demolished to make way for the military camp. Well, post-war, in fact, it was demolished for the tower to be built that many of you will recognise. You can see it from the M40. Next. Coming of the railway, Colonel Dupre was very significant because it passed through his land and he gave permission for it to be built. And these are some wonderful images, in fact, of the construction of the railway, which was prior to HS2, was the last national railway to be built, in fact. Whilst reputedly the railways were built by Irish navvies, and indeed much of the work was done by Irish navvies, but also local men as well. In fact, in the top left-hand photograph, I am told that if you look carefully at the young lad in the door of that contraption there, who is holding a dog, that is another Joseph Payne, the younger Joseph Payne of the Payne family, helping to build our railway. Next. There it is, opening up. It didn't actually open until just post the First World War in about 1818. It was called Beaconsfield Golf Hole because the condition of Colonel Dupre was they could come across his land, so as long as they built him a station. So there we are for his golf course, which didn't actually exist at the time, but he used that as the catalyst to build it. And it subsequently became our station of Seer Green and Jordan Station, though it does indeed still serve Beaconsfield Golf Club. Next. So this is Wilton Park, which is on our doorstep, but we certainly include in our research project because it is such a fascinating and important development. This would have been taken soon after the demolition of the White House. You can see the tower block there, which replaced it. It has a long and fascinating history, both going back into the Dupre family, but also through World War II and onwards. It was the center for German interrogation of German officers. Then it became a denazification center. And MI9, which not many people have heard about, was based there. And it subsequently became a language training college. And we trained such luminaries as Colonel Gaddafi at Wilton Park and so on. And now, of course, it goes into its next phase of development, and it's very much a local controversy as to what that centre is going to be used for. And there's big housing development being proposed there, which obviously we're watching with tremendous interest and importance. So we go in our communities of Seer Green and Jordans from well back into the 16th century with our buildings through to modern atomic warfare. This was one of the Western control centres for nuclear war and so on. So we've got the full span of history within our communities, and we're trying to bring that together as much as we can. I'd like to turn now to a short presentation which was put together for us by Chris Jenkins, who is the manager of Jordan's Village Limited, and just to focus in on the next stage, really, of consolidating the information as we collect it. Next, please. So we've heard that Jordan's had its centenary last year, and as part of that celebration, the community pulled together some wonderful information on the 100 years of development of the Jordan's Village. It was pulled together into a timeline. At the bottom of this slide, you can see the timeline. It was consolidated into these images. Much of the information was taken. Nigel has made reference to the making of the community book, but Jordan's Village has got fantastic archive records. If you come to Jordan's, you will see the small building on the green, which is in fact the estate office, and I call it their TARDIS, because if you go inside, it seems to grow, and every piece of paper or minute ever recorded in Jordan's you will find within it. It's a wonderful, wonderful focal point for our research. Next. So each of these pieces of information were put onto 10 A1 size slides, which were demonstrated at the centenary celebrations in June 2019. So this was a wonderful source of information for us in terms of our research themes. But the challenge, of course, was to take this information and turn it into some digital form while relating to the stories around it. Next. So examples of the stories for the development of Jordan's Village itself, going back to 19. This is very well recorded. The individuals who actually came, walked the village, Arthur Pickstock and Fred Roundtree, actually put together the original drawings of the development of the village itself, and this is fantastically well recorded, both in minutes and in maps like the one on the top right. Next. The establishment of the village itself, very well documented, and so on. And here's the early rent book, and you can see in the image we've got images of the actual construction of the village as it progressed, with the famous Roundtree family, which, yes, it is the chocolate family and so on, who helped to design and build the village as an ideal community, a model village, unlike the place next door in Seer Green, with all of its profanities, but we've been told by then, with market garden, beekeeping, poultry keeping, and so on, village industries. So it was almost designed very much as a self-sustaining community, which opened in the around 1920. Next. So examples, the school opening up in 1929, a private school, which then became the Longdean School, and subsequently the Jordan's Village School, and the village school, which moved then in 1944, the small village school as it is today. Next. And Nigel has referred to this, in fact, the Jordan's players, the Nettle and the Mayflower, so on, wonderfully recorded, wonderful photographs of culture within the Jordan's Village. Next. This was a wonderful story which got national attention. Jordan's has got its green, and its village green, which was a centre for cricket for many, many, many years, until one or two of the villagers, for some reason, complained about having cricket balls going through their front windows and bouncing off their cars and so on. and rather unsportingly took it to the law and got cricket, attempted to get cricket banned within Jordans and so on. And this actually went to the High Court, I understand. You can see some press reports there. And the judge threw it out and said that every Englishman had the right to play cricket on his green. But in fact, there were conditions attached and about putting up nets and so on, which proved to be rather too heavy, those conditions. So the cricket moved to Seer Green and continued after that. Next. So those are some of the stories and some of the data, but how do we capture it? How do we put it into GIS? Well, here you've got an example of the work that has been done by Chris Jenkins in particular, where he's taken each of those events and he's related them to a theme of our research. He's got the dates, the activities and so on, the location of the event, what actually is available in terms of information published and photographs and so on. And then critically, he has assigned to those a location marker, which we can then use to position those on the map with coordinates. So we can bring this information together onto the maps and start to display it dynamically, so that it is more than just on boards and so on. People can go in and track it through in time and see it where these things happened on the maps. And that's our link, in fact, into our next presentation, where we start to show how we are pulling this information together on the GIS software. And this will be led for us by Nigel Rothwell.
Thank you, Alan, and good afternoon to everybody. So I'm now going to talk to you about bringing together the archival sources and the oral histories, and introduce you to two other dimensions, those of space and time. Next, please. So a range of historical map resources are available to us from the public domain. Alan has already introduced the 1753 Francis Godolphin estate map you see on the top left, and also the 1831 enclosure map, second in on the bottom left. The detailed mapping of geographic regions really began in the 17th century, so there are earlier maps, but none available to us that specifically mention the hamlet of Green, unless of course any of the audience today know different. And if you are aware of any other maps that predate these, then please do let us know. Estate surveying practices were quite accurate. Thank you, Owen. Estate surveying practices were quite accurate, and regional and county maps became much more available in the 18th and 19th centuries as printing became cheaper. The selection I've used all identify Seer Green and tell us something about communication and transport routes in the area. Many of you listening today are probably familiar with the Jeffreys and Bryant maps. Unfortunately, beautiful though they are, they do show quite a high degree of wear over the Seer Green area. In the 19th century, the maps start to become available. This you see there, top right, the 1812 Ordnance Survey drawing for the High Wycombe area. These were initially compiled, but by the end of the century, they start to resemble the detailed modern maps that we're all familiar with. All of these maps, though, require some degree of georeferencing. That is, they need to be aligned to a consistent cartographic grid system so that we can compare them to each other and to the modern maps. Next, please, Owen. Our intent, as Alan's described, is to develop an online resource using a geographic information system, a GIS portal. We're doing this using a freely publicly accessible portal, GIS Online, and we will be using one of their tools called StoryMap. We aren't quite at this stage yet with our Living Village project, but I wanted to illustrate is a story map created by the Museum of London, and it exists online at this address. It allows the user to interrogate the maps and the underlying data. It has a number of chapters. You can see that on the left there. This one that I've pulled up is on Roman archaeology in London, and there's some narrative that goes along with it. The data points on the map, which is a geological base map, represents finds and can be clicked on to reveal some information about the location of the find spot. Next, please, Owen. And this is another example. It's Bristol City Council's Know Your Place project, and it too uses the same ArcGIS tools. Here we've zoomed in to a greater level of detail so that we can identify individual buildings, with a modern map on the right and a historical map on the left. And there's a slider in the middle, an interactivity, so you can move backwards and forwards between the two. Various data sources can be selected for display, and you can see a menu of those on the right-hand side here. And the data points that then pop up on the map can be clicked on to reveal information and images. This is very much the sort of concept we have in mind for Seer, Green and Jordan's, but this is a much more sophisticated version of than we'll be able to achieve. And this one for Bristol has an enormous amount of resource behind it. Next, please, Owen. So how do we get there? In the pyramid on the right, I'm illustrating the steps involved, and on the left, some of the software tools that we're using. So starting at a foundation level, we have needed to and have indeed defined our area of interest. And then we've sourced and built a base map that works for us. A number of base maps, which are good for a lower resolution regional presentation, but we building level, similar to what we saw in Bristol. I've already mentioned some of the historic maps that we have sourced and the essential georeferencing process, and I'll show you more of these shortly. And then we've heard from previous speakers who've talked to us about the various research strands and the data compilation process. So once this information has been pulled together, it needs to be categorized, assigned to date intervals, and referenced to specific locations so it can be spotted on the map interface. We've seen an example of this compiled in a spreadsheet format, and we'll return to this shortly. And images are being compiled, but also need to be assigned to specific locations. That in place, we can then start to build the narratives that tell the stories that we want to illustrate and allow the user the control to do that themselves. Next, please. Where has all this map data come from? To build a database, or a base map rather, that is scalable, that is, it works at various resolutions so that we can stand back and look at it both from a semi-regional perspective, if you like, but can also zoom down to the building level. We've used the kind support of Seer Green Parish Council to access the highest detailed maps that the Ordnance Survey produce, what the Ordnance Survey call their master map topography. And that's then available through the Parish Council through a public sector mapping agreement. The regional vector map district data is available to us open source. The historic maps come from a number of various public sources and at various scales, again emphasizing the need to be able to present these on top of an appropriately scaled base map. Differently scaled maps being needed for different comparisons and different purposes. And when it comes to the estate and the tides maps, we want to be able to zoom into specific fields as well as buildings. Next, please, Owen. So now I can show you our base map, and here we are zoomed out at a sort of semi-regional scale, if you like. This is at the Ordnance Survey Vector Map District resolution, and our area of interest is bounded to the north by Bottrell's Lane, to the south by the A40, to the west by the A355, and to the east by Narcutts Lane. So that's our area of interest. And now we can gently zoom into Holy Trinity Church in the centre of Seer Green. We'll just step through. Thank you, Owen, if you can just step through that for me, please, so we can just zoom in and see that detail emerging. Okay. So now the user is able to go backwards and forwards through that and pick a resolution that works for whatever it is that they're particularly interested in viewing at the time. And now we can compare historic maps with the current map. So we can pierce through an archive of historical map data, and we can do this in one of two ways. Example that I showed, that slider bar that cut the screen in two, enabled us to move side to side and reveal the historic map adjacent to the modern map. Here in this in this slide presentation, we're going to peer through just by varying the transparency. So, Owen, if you could just step through the next couple of clicks, please. And one more, I think. So here we're looking from 2020 back to century to the map of 1896. And again, we can do this now with all the maps that we have loaded, now that they've been properly georeferenced. So let's make some meaningful comparisons between the maps and see what the maps are showing us. Here we've got an example, the 1753 Godolphin map we've referred to a number of times, and the 20 survey map. I'm looking at this at the vector map local resolution. So this you might think of as being about 6 inches to a mile type scale. Next, please, Owen. And I'm now showing one map on top of the other with a degree of transparency, so we can see through one layer to the other. And what's immediately obvious to us, I think, is that we can see that 1753 field pattern. It's immediately recognizable in the landscape that we know around Seer Green. And these field boundaries that exist now, they existed in 1753, and they were probably old then. And another thing actually about this particular representation is it demonstrates to us how remarkably accurately those fields were surveyed. Another thing we can see here is that field pattern can be traced into the residential areas and has influenced the modern settlement patterns. And we can also see where some of the modern road names originate, even though they might well have been translated from their original point of origin and moved to a different part of the village, which I think is quite interesting. Next, please. So let's also have a look at the evolution of the village centre. How Seer Green has matured from a small hamlet to a village of some significant size. So here we're comparing 1753 to 1831 and then 1831 through to the modern map. Next, please, Owen. So overlaying 1753 on a semi-transparent 1831 map. Next, please. We can see immediately how the road layout in the centre changed in order to create the sort of model village that that Alan mentioned earlier, creating that space for a proper village. And next, and now overlaying 1831 with 2020. Next, please. We can see village ponds that existed in the middle of the 19th century. Probably ephemeral dew ponds that no longer exist today, though if you live in the vicinity of any of these, you might. And next, please, Owen. So lastly, as we compare these maps, I'm going to zoom out to a lower, more semi-regional resolution, if you like. And I've picked particularly the 1820 Jeffreys and Bryant maps here because they will be familiar to a number of people in the audience. And we're semi-transparent laying 1760 on 2020. And next, please, Owen. And I just want to highlight here some of the important routeways that were mapped in 1760, north through Hodgemore Woods and west across to the Beaconsfield Amersham Road, which today we would barely recognize as trackways. And next, similarly, we'll do the same thing with 1820 and 2020, and again highlights some of the routeways that were mapped in 1820, which are barely discernible to us today. So we see one there running to the northeast from New Barn. To the south of that, interestingly, a trackway that just doesn't exist today, going out to the centre of Seer Green across to Jordan's, and then routes up to Hastings and up to Grove Farm out of Jordan's. Next, please, Owen. So now we've got most of the components in place to start revealing the stories, and I'm going to illustrate this with a couple of Jordan's examples. The oral histories have been compiled into a spreadsheet and referenced in various ways. And now we can post that data on a map, color-coded in this particular case by the various research themes. Next, please. Integrating that data with the map data, we can interrogate it in a number of various ways. Next. So firstly, by theme. And I've chosen here to use the higher resolution 25-inch to a mile turn of the century map and look at the built environment in Jordan's. And here I've just clicked on one of these dots which come out of that spreadsheet database, and we have that meeting that Alan referred to earlier in 1919, which led to the land purchase and allocation. Next. And now by date, I've chosen to use a later map, 1926 map, after the arrival of the railway, and at the lower resolution of 6 inches to a mile. And here I'm looking at events within the decade of the 1910s, with the railway leading to a resurgence in Quaker life. Thanks, Owen. And other map resources that are available to us, I just want to mention these brief. The data that we've got loaded into the database includes data from the British Geological Survey, so we can see surface geology, bedrock, and soil types, and also data that comes from the County Council, including rights of way, the historic environment record, and a nice utility that looks at World War II bomb sites. Next, thank you. Of course, there's more to do. There's more map data still to be sourced and loaded. Of course, there's been a significant learning curve with all of this, and some of what we've done has been by way of a trial. So in both senses of the word, I must admit. But particularly with regards to having comparable scale historic OS maps, I've used screen captures in some case to kind of refine the process, and that reduces the image definition. So we need to purchase the higher definition images from the National Library of Scotland in order to improve this. And then there's Jordan's estate maps, the 1841 tithe map, which is still to be loaded and georeferenced. And if anybody knows about this intriguing reference to a Norman map, which is referred to on the Parish Council website around the time of the Domesday Book, I'd be very interested to know about this. I might add that Seer Green is not actually mentioned in the Domesday sources. And then there's the other data that from the research groups that Alan's been talking about. This data still needs to be loaded, and also the image collection needs also to be properly referenced and loaded. And then next year, we're hoping that we'll be able to have direct access to the Chiltern Conservation Board's LiDAR data. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. All of these steps then are taking us closer to the pinnacle of that pyramid and to building this online story map. And at that, I'll hand back to Alan. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nigel. I must say, I'd like to say a special word of thanks to Nigel, who's invested an enormous amount of time and effort into pulling those maps together. It's a steep learning curve, and he's done a fantastic job. As he said, we've still got somewhere to go. But if there are any of you joining us today who are particularly interested in that technical aspect, then you know, we really would like to hear from you, because we not only want to create these maps for Seer, Green and Jordan's, as I said at the beginning, we want to turn this into a template that others can take away through the Children's Society and use in their own communities. So that multiplication process is very important to us, and I hope that, you know, this event today will be one way in which we can bring people into that. Drawing towards a conclusion now of our formal presentations, I'd like to say a few words about our interactions with other local initiatives, because clearly there is an enormous amount going on in this area, I'm pleased to say, in other communities. Next. So I've mentioned here some, but I doubt all of the interactions that we're currently having. Hugh Howes, who is with us this afternoon as one of the delegates, and who you could well bring in later on if you like to talk with him, or you could email him, message him directly. Hugh is a fantastic researcher and publisher, and he's currently working on a very ambitious project, industrial archaeology in the Chilterns and so on. And clearly that comes into our area, and we're aiming to provide Hugh with answers about what the industry was in this area and so on. But it's a very ambitious project that Hugh has got stuck into and working with the Chiltern Society on, and we wish him all good fortune with that. I'm sure he will succeed, but that's one of the first things I thought I would mention. The second one is the Woodlanders Lives and Landscape project, being led by Dr. Helena Chance, which is part of a major project that the Chiltern Conservation Board is running called Chalk, Cherries and Chairs, the Landscaping Partnership. We've got major funding and resourcing for that project. And I think we're fortunate enough to have in the audience today one of the team members there, which is Leslie Hoskins and so on. So again, if you have any particular points, you could either chat those message to Leslie or bring them up, and we'll talk about that in more detail. But that's a very significant project. Thirdly, one of the important support pillars for this project is the Chiltern Society's GIS group, chaired by Greg Wright, and that is now really gaining some momentum. We had a meeting last Monday, and lots of new enthusiastic members joining that group and starting to drive new projects like footpaths and even ash dieback projects, tracking of trees and so on within the area and so on. So again, that's very useful support for us, and also if you'd like to get involved, I'm sure Greg would be delighted to hear from you. And finally, for now, again, the Chiltern Conservation Board's Beacons of the Past project, which is a fantastic technological project where the CCB has got funding to do a survey of the whole area of the Chilterns, and Nigel's going to come back in just a moment and say a few more words about that. But clearly, from our point of view, Seer, Green and Jordan's, we're very excited about what that LiDAR survey may throw up for our particular area. So Nigel, could I bring you back in, please? And you could say a few last words about the Beacons of the Past project.
Thank you. Yes, I'm going to say a little bit about Beacons of the Past then, and specifically about the LiDAR data. This data was acquired in the winter of 2018-19. The image in the top right of this slide shows a footprint of the data over the Chilterns area of outstanding natural beauty. This was the largest survey of its kind to have been acquired in the UK. I should say that in case you don't recognise the image there, that the footprint is the light blue and the AONB is in the green colour. This data has been made available publicly as a citizen science project through the website that's on the slide there. And to date, over 10,000 potential archaeological features have been recognised by citizen scientists, and the project team of which I'm a member is about a third of the way through reviewing and confirming these. So there's still a long way to go. So this part of our presentation is not intended as a LiDAR tutorial. For that, please consult the website and get in touch with the project team. Essentially, though, the data is acquired or was acquired through on laser at the ground surface and recording its return. You can consider that in some respects to be the light equivalent of radio waves in or sound waves in sonar. The bottom right image here shows an example of LiDAR acquired by the Environment Agency. Buildings, and in the center of this image, a flat yellow spot, which is Camp Hillfort in Gerrards Cross. This Environment Agency data has a resolution of about square meter, so 1 pixel represents a square meter. I'm going to show you a couple of images of areas within Seer Green Parish. And the first thing that we should note is that the resolution of approximately a 1/16 of a square meter. So that is, it can resolve features down to about 25 centimeters. Thanks, Owen, for bringing that up. The clever processing of the data here has removed the buildings and the trees, so that we're only looking at the land surface, what is called a local relief model. So for anybody not used to looking at this type of data, which I suspect is most people, I'll draw your attention first to the scale bar in the bottom right. So the field of view here is about 1 square kilometer in total. Secondly, dark is negative and light is positive. So we're seeing undulations on the land surface. And some of you will immediately know where this is. I'm not going to say. However, what the data is showing us is simply stunning. It's revealing a really rich and exciting pre and early history within the parish that we were simply unaware of, as well as showing us specific work locations for where some of the villagers that we've already met would have been working. And I've listed here on the slide some of the features that can be recognized. I mean, it's important to note that the LiDAR itself obviously can't, well, I say obviously, it can't give us dates of any features. It can give us a sense of what's older and what's younger. And I have tried to list them here from the sort of the most likely oldest to the youngest. So within this square kilometer, we're seeing prehistoric field system in the upper part of the slide. And possibly also an early Romano-British. One of the most striking features you'll see here is the line running from the top right to the bottom left across the image, which almost beggars belief. This is a Roman road, Aga, and associated quarry pits. And then probably one of the other most striking features on this image is sort of some of the tiger striping that you can see, which is medieval ridge and furrow. And then there are chalk pits and dew ponds, wood banks, extraction pits, and they're the dark things that jump out. Extraction of clay, probably mostly, but possibly also gravel and flint. There are saw pits on this image, so some of the woodworkers that we've already met working in some of these saw pits. And then around the edges we can see enclosed field boundaries, a multitude of trackways cutting across here, connecting the sites, and also on this image World War II building platforms. So Alan mentioned earlier, the rich history that we have in the region from the 16th century through to modern times, and actually with this data we're pushing that back another couple of thousand years probably. And the next slide, please, Owen. And so one more example, and again, please note here the change in scale at the bottom right, and again I've listed some of the recognizable features. And once again, I'm not going to say where this is. It is of some size and significance, and it offers us the intriguing possibility that this could be the site of. So you see that a potentially medieval ditched enclosure right in the middle of the image here. And then again, we're seeing chalk pits and possible dew ponds. Chalk pits would have been important for the agricultural use of the land here when this was used for sheep and cattle. It's amazing how much calcium they take out of the soil. So digging out chalk and spreading it on the fields was very important. And again, we can see enclosed field boundaries here. And for those of you who've really got a fine eye for detail and have got your eye in, you might see these envelope patterns, which are the legacy of square ploughing, which would have taken place in the early part of the 20th century. And I think at that, Alan, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks very much, Nigel. Absolutely fabulous images, fascinating, as you say, taking us back just another few thousand years into our local history, and clearly the potential for incorporating that new information, brand new information, is absolutely fascinating for us. Now that actually brings us to the end of our formal session, and I've got one last slide, in fact, to put up after the Q&A about where we're going next, but I'd like to open it up because we're absolutely spot on time to the minute. How about that, folks, in terms of our own internal planning for the timing. Now we're going to go into what for me is going to be slightly mysterious times in terms of how we manage the Q&A through Zoom. And I'll be relying on Owen to perhaps, if you want us to bring you in to actually talk about your question or to come in on video, then I think we have the capacity to do that. If you don't, I will just flag up the questions that have come in so far. Please let us have more. I'm sure those last slides must have triggered some wonderful thoughts in your minds. Please let us have your questions. I've got 2 or 3 here that we can start off with. I've got a couple of questions from Sally Scargill regarding audio recordings. The question is how we're planning to add the audio recordings of oral history, and also prior to that you asked about adding in cine films and so on. Let me kick that off and then I'll open it up. I mean, clearly any of these, any audio recordings, video recordings, the fact is that we have the potential to add in any and all of these things once they're digitized. So Nigel showed you that you can point at a spot on the map, click on it, and then give you the information that's available. That information may be photographs, it may be script, it can be oral, it can be video. This is the great, fantastic power of the tool. Now, having said that, I'm not saying we are in a position to do all of those things immediately, but the potential is certainly there. So that's my response to that initially. I also have a reflection that we've got with us, I believe we have with us Leslie Hoskins from the Chiltern Conservation Board project, who are particularly collecting oral histories and so on. So if Leslie or Sally would like to come in a bit more on that question, I think, Owen, we have the capacity to bring them in.
Hello.
Hello.
Right. Okay. Yes. So I'm Leslie Hoskins. Hello.
Hi, Leslie. Would you like to say a few words about what you're planning to do with oral histories?
Yes. What we're doing at the moment. So the Woodlanders Lives and Landscapes project is looking at the central Chilterns, and it's looking particularly at the rural industries, the cottage industries that people were working in the 19th and first half of the 20th centuries. That would be lace making, chair bodging, straw plaiting, and we're just beginning to work on tambour beading or beading, which is a little bit mysterious at the moment. And we're doing that partly through the sort of things that you've been doing, like census. We're gathering a lot of census data about a lot of different villages. So we've got more of a spread of material, but we are also engaged on gathering oral histories from people who might know of people who worked in those cottage industries, and they might be family members, you know, people's grandparents, great-grandparents, and have those kind of memories. And at the moment we're recording those, and we're doing summaries, quite accurate summaries, not actually doing full transcriptions of those activities, of those recordings, sorry. And we are indeed looking for more people to talk to. I mean, you know, I'm very fascinated by your lace hall. So I think that's what we're doing, and we are going to lodge all this material at the end, all the stuff that we're gathering. We're gathering it quite systematically. We're going to lodge it with the Bucks Archive in due course, and in the meantime, we're going to be producing various kind of outputs like walks and talks and maps.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Thank you. Am I on mic? Yes. Thanks very much, Leslie. It's very, very interesting. Obviously, we can make information available to people about that. Yeah, we're keen to interact with you positively on that. We've got some old DVD recordings that one of the villagers put together of interviewing old residents. He did this 20 years ago or so. But we also got some people in the village who've got fascinating recollections of the families and so on. And to the extent we can connect with your agenda, we'd certainly like to do that. Moving on, I've got a question from Hugh about factories and so on. He'd asked about was it just local bodging here in the village, or did we actually do furniture assembly? My understanding is that there was no local furniture factory here as such, but I'm quite willing to admit that I'm wrong there, and it may be that some of the local people who are tuned in would like to come in on that point. My understanding at this stage is that the bodging was done here, the chair legs were made and shipped off to High Wycombe. But I'm interested to hear if any others would like to contribute on that. I know that we did have behind the cricketers, the Jolly Cricketers pub, we had a place where they made coffins, and there was obviously, like in all local communities, a good trade in coffins and so on. They were made and stored in made behind the pub and stored in one of the local houses. But beyond that, I'm not aware. But as I say, I'm open to hearing from anyone who'd like to add to that. While you like think about that, I mean, Nigel Morgan, who's well onto the case here, is giving me chapter and verse on the cricket. The case went to County Court judgment in favour of the club on the 10th of May 1994. I did hear a wicked rumour around about that time that the judge was actually a personal friend of one of the residents in Jordan's, but I'm sure that went to school with him, but I can't believe that in any way influenced his judgment, but it went in favour of the village, and rightly so indeed. There's a question also about Wilton Park and its history. To what extent is it classified and so on? Again, I'd like to bring in Nigel there, and we can hear him live this time rather than recorded, because he has an intimate knowledge of Wilton Park and MI9. So Nigel, could I bring you in, please?
Yes, by all means. Wilton Park, very interesting. It was the headquarters of MI9 and MI19 during World War II. It was requisitioned from the Colonel Dupre, the then Colonel Dupre, in late 1940, and the MI9 headquarters were there until 2014, when they were demolished, one quiet weekend in September 2014. In 1942, on the same site, MI19 started up, which was the interrogation of German prisoners of war, as has already been mentioned, including some very high-ranking officers. They didn't stay there long, but they were interrogated and then went on to the other prison camps. But the difference was that every single room, and indeed tree, on the site was bugged for sound, so that all their conversations would be listened to by the secret listeners, and they would be recorded, and a lot of useful information, including on the V1 and V2 rockets, was overheard there and at their sister places like Latimer House and Trent Park. So very useful stuff was picked up there. My father was an interrogator there from June 1942 until the end of the war. 5 years after that, for 5 years after that, it was the Centre for the Denazification Programme run by the Foreign Office, where again my father stayed on as a lecturer, as did Matthew Barry Sullivan, who lived in Jordans. And then they were sent packing to Sussex, Staining in Sussex, when the MOD took it over to build some kind of still slightly mysterious business to do with atomic or hydrogen bombs. But that was up to 1951. I don't think there's anything still about it that remains classified as of now. Well, that's in rather a convoluted nutshell. Anything else that I need to add on that, Alan?
No, that sounds great.
Just to say that the building itself, the Wilson Park building, that lovely White House that you showed, was demolished. It was there until 1968, and it only came down in 68 to build the Wilson Hilton, as we rather naughtily call it, that was only habitable for a few years and is now used for SAS training, I think, occasionally.
Right, thank you very much indeed. So if anyone would like to know more about that, I mean, there are publications available as well. Nigel is very much on top of that. Thank you very much, Nigel.
Yeah, just to say, Alan, on the subject of MI9, which was Wilson Park, a book has come out in the last 2 weeks by Helen Fry, and it is quite excellent. MI9 by Helen Fry.
And Nigel's not on commission.
No.
Thank you very much. A question coming from Marianne Hall about the natural history material. We have in fact, thank you for raising that, we have in fact collected a very substantial schedule of natural history events and so on, which is still to be fully developed and related to photographs and so on. So we've made some significant progress in that area, but still much to do. And anyone interested in that area, obviously we'd love to hear from you. Marianne also mentioned the Seer, Green and Jordan Society hedge survey, for example, which I remember very well. We went down to Bottom Lane, which is the lane that is the boundary of the village on the western side, which goes back way into medieval time, and there is a survey methodology you could use to judge the age of the hedgerows and so on. And as I recall, the survey indicated 600 to 800 years old for the hedgerows down there, which is well believable. The other point that you raise in your question, Marianne, is about national data. We haven't looked at that yet. If anybody has it or knows how we can get it and how we could relate it to the local project, I'm sure we'd be delighted to hear about that, because clearly the interaction between built environment, natural environment and people's lives and so on is really at the crux of everything that we're looking at. Okay, right, I've got a new point coming in from Sally, but just while I absorb that, any other points from earlier? Let me just have a look. We talked about local factories and so on. One new message coming in. Sally is saying that her local history group has got audio links on their website. Okay, that's Flagwell Heath. Okay, we'll be very interested to look at that and so on, and see how it can interact with other projects and so on. Right, I'm going to draw a line there for the moment. Thank you very much. If anything comes up in the next 5 minutes, but I'm not closing the session just yet. We're just going to go on to one final slide, which is about where we're going next. We've touched on some of these points already. Next slide. So one of our great challenges, obviously, in the last 6 months has been sustaining momentum on the project during the time of COVID-19. I won't be dishonest and say we haven't lost the momentum, because obviously we have. Many of the volunteers in the communities who've been working on the project have been pulled off, understandably, onto other things. Why have I jumped? Thank you. But this is part of our really good regaining momentum. We've got to learn to use tools like Zoom and other online tools to really keep this going and so on, so that we really push forward on what we've learned already. So the challenge, we've got to extend our knowledge within the group and beyond the group of ArcGIS. It is a learning curve and so on, but we are getting there. Nigel is showing us the way. The development of our population and people information into spatial format. So we've got wonderful analysis done by Dave Morris and others within the village of the surveys, showing us, you know, patterns of living within the village and employment. We now got to figure out how to map that so that people can look at that dynamically. We've got to do the same with our research strands, turn it into spatial format in line with the Jordan's Time database and so on, again, so map it. And I think we will be focusing on a number of those strands to make that happen over the next 6 months. Sorry, I'm just getting a message here going off my screen. Somebody just saying goodbye, thank you. So we've got a great local team, a technical team, most of whom you've seen today and heard from, and a local community team who are pulling information together for us locally and regionally. Obviously, we're open to engage with other people. If this has inspired you in any way, please do get in touch and join in with us. And we've got some shorter term targets as well. Turning to Chiltern Society. Chiltern Society has got a heritage workshop scheduled on the 21st of November 2020, so in a couple of months' time, or is that a month's time now? I don't know whether that will be physical. It was going to be at the Wickham Museum, I think, but we'll see how that develops. And then looking 12 months ahead, well, we will be here again at the 2021 Heritage Festival. Hopefully, we will be face to face rather than online, and we'll be able to embrace one another both physically and intellectually at those events. So we're looking forward to that. So I hope you've enjoyed this quick run through of our project, and I'd like to thank you very much for your involvement and your engagement. If you want to follow through, there's my email address, alan.kell@igsystems.co.uk. Please feel free to use that to follow up, and indeed obviously through Chiltern Society, where you have registered, most of you, so that you can make contact with the Chiltern Society. Hello, I was just correcting the address, I think, igsystems.co.uk. Alan Kell. Thank you very much indeed. I'll just finally look to see at chat to see if there's anything else coming in to respond to. And now I think we're just getting a little bit to exchange. And obviously, we'll keep that open for the next 15 minutes if anyone would like to follow up on that. Again, my thanks to all of you for, particularly to the speakers, obviously, for their contribution. We've enjoyed putting this together. It's been very productive for us. And thank you very much for tuning in. And I hope you've got some pleasure and enjoyment from this afternoon's session. Thank you and goodbye.